As I was preparing for this sermon, I got to thinking, because we get to see Paul go to a number of pretty cool places. He goes to Crete, he goes to Malta, he goes to Rome, like all those Mediterranean places that cruises go to. And it got me thinking, how many of you in here would be like, yes, I would like to take a Mediterranean cruise and go to all the places Paul went? Anybody? Like, I would love to do that if money were no object. But I did a little bit of research for us because I knew y'all would want to go. So I figured, let me do my research. Let me do my due diligence. And what I found is there are some options for us. We can go, Celebrity Cruises has a cruise where we can go to two of the places that Paul visits in this sort of journey that we watch him go through today. And it's only $2,915 a person. That's all food included. But I was like, that doesn't go to all the places that Paul goes to. And I would love to go to all the places that Paul goes to. And I could not find a cruise that did that. So I have another option. Did you know you can rent a yacht by the week? Did any of you know this? I guess really, really rich people do, which is the reason I didn't know you could do this, because I'm not really, really rich. But you can do this, and so what I found is this yacht, we'll have to rent a few of them for all of us. It can only hold 36. I know. But we can rent this yacht, and we can go to all these places that Paul traversed, and it's only $738,000 a week. So, but divide that by 36, and it's only $20,000 a person. So I'm just letting you know, if y'all want to get a group together, we can rent this yacht right here. If we get too many, we'll just rent a few. Does that sound good? All of you are like, nope, not doing that cruise. But as we look at today, I mean, we can look at all these Mediterranean cruises and all, and sure, that would be fun to do. I don't have that money, but sorry to break it to you. But it would be fun to do this, but we look at the passage today, and Paul really wasn't on much of a cruise. Yes, he was on a ship, but I would not call what he did a relaxing cruise. Like, if you look at the passage today, it's more of rather than a cruise, it's more of a mixture of like Robinson Crusoe, the movie The Perfect Storm, maybe some Swiss Family Robinson, and throw some Gilligan's Island in there, okay? Like, that's sort of what's going on in this passage today. And so we're going to dive in, and what we're going to see in the passage, what God's going to teach us is that we should rely upon God's faithfulness in the midst of hardships. This is not the easiest journey for Paul. It's just not. But what we see is we see him rely upon God's faithfulness in the midst of hardship, in the midst of difficult circumstances. And as we get to the end of the sermon today, we're going to ask, okay, well, how do we do that? It's good to say that we should rely upon God's faithfulness, but how do we do that? How does the rubber meet the road? And so we're going to dive into that today. Remember last week, we saw that Paul appeals to Caesar. Remember, he's been going for about 2 years. He's been going from trial to trial to trial, and he appears before a number of individuals, an individual by the name of Felix, by the name of Festus, and then an individual by the name of Agrippa. And he appeals before all these individuals and presents the gospel and presents his case. And then we come to Acts 25, verse 11, and Paul is before Festus, and he says this. He says, if then I did anything wrong and am deserving of death, I'm not trying to escape death. But if there's nothing to what these men accuse me of, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. So Paul says, hey, I haven't done anything wrong. If I have, I'm willing to pay the consequences, but I haven't. I'm going to appeal my case to Caesar. At which point, remember last week, Festus says, well, you have appealed to Caesar you will go. Well, Paul is talking to Festus in Caesarea, which is right here. Caesar is where? Rome. So Paul has to get from point A to point B, and it's going to take a little bit of a journey. Now, typically, in good circumstances, this journey would be about 5 weeks. In ideal sort of circumstances, how many of y'all think Paul makes it in 5 weeks? You would be correct. He does not. Paul takes over 4 months to make this journey because he comes up against a few things. There's storms. It happens to be wintertime, so they've got to stay somewhere before they get to their destination. There's a shipwreck and all these different obstacles that Paul has to face. So how many of y'all are ready for this trip? Are you ready? Yeah. All right, well, let's go.
Just sit right back and you'll hear a tale of a fateful trip that started from this tropic port.
This is now going to be stuck in your head all day, and for that, I just want to say, you're welcome. As you go about the rest of your day, you're going to be ordering your lunch and you're going to be singing the song to Gilligan's Island. But when you do that, please remember the point of the sermon too. That would be helpful. It would make me feel a little bit better if you somehow connected the two. Anyway, so Paul starts in Caesarea, and we're going to sort of cover it in three distinct sections. So there's Caesarea to Myra, and Acts 27, starting in verse 1. If you have your Bibles, you can open there. It says this. It says, when it was decided that we were to sail to Italy, they handed over Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion named Julius of the imperial regiment. When we had boarded a ship of Adramyttium, that's a fun name, we put to sea, intending to sail to ports along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. So as we read this passage, we see a few things. First, that Paul has some companions with him. Because it says that we were to set sail. Now, who does we refer to? Luke. Who's writing the book of Acts? Luke. So Paul is sort of the main topic. Luke is writing it. And Luke, based on this, is here with him along with Aristarchus. So Paul has some individuals with him. But also, Paul, the passage says, some other prisoners. Now, that makes it sound like, okay, there are a few, but if we read later in the chapter, once they've switched ships, it's about 276. So, like, close quarters, okay? Like, they're not sailing on that yacht that I pictured. Like, don't think that. This is sort of a rudimentary ship to get them from point A to point B. They've got 200 and some individuals, and so they go from Caesarea, they go to a place named Sidon. In Acts 27, verse 3, Julius treated Paul kindly and allowed him to go to his friends to receive their care. So at Sidon, what does Paul do? He gets to go and be encouraged by other believers. And I want you to remember this because we're going to come back to this later. But just remember that along this journey, Paul was encouraged by other believers to continue living out the faith. So they go from Caesarea, they end up in Myra, and the next section of this trip is Myra to Malta. Now I read Malta and I think malt, and now I want a milkshake. Well, this is tough. Okay, what happens is they get a new ship in Myra, and what they had been traveling on was sort of a coastal boat. It wasn't meant to go sort of overseas. And so now they get a freight ship in Myra, and slowly they sail Myra to Cnidus, to Salmon, to Fairhaven, which is near Lasea. And Fairhaven actually means good harbor, which sounds nice. Like, oh, I would want to, dock at Good Harbor, would I not? Well, the problem is that it's wintertime. And winter is not when you want to be sailing around these areas. Acts 27, verse 9, by now much time had passed, and the voyage was already dangerous. Since the Day of Atonement was already over, which Day of Atonement would mean it was late September, early October, so it's wintertime. And Paul gave his advice and told them, men, I can see that this voyage is headed toward disaster and heavy loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. So Paul says, hey guys, I'm going to give my advice here. We probably should not sail anywhere else. We should just stay here for the winter, because Paul has been through being shipwrecked 3 times at this point. So he's an expert on being shipwrecked. I don't know if you want to be an expert on that, but Paul is. And so he's, hey guys, I've got some experience and we should stay put for a little bit. How many of you think they listen to Paul? No, they do not. And he reminds them of it later, and I think it's really funny, but they don't listen to him. So they go and they set sail for Malta. And initially, as they're sort of going, they set sail to Malta, there's this nice gentle wind that springs up. And so I can imagine the crew like, ha, Paul, what were you worried about? This is great. We're going to get there in no time. All will be well. And then we get to verse 14. But before long, a fierce wind called the nor'eastern rushed down from the island. And the Bible could just say right there, it gets worse from there. Like that's sort of the story. It just keeps getting worse. This storm comes up. The boat is driven by the wind. They shelter at a place called Cauda. And what it says they were barely able to get control of the ship. Like they couldn't steer it. They had no control. The ship was just drifting in the storm. I imagine the crew getting together and maybe singing Carrie Underwood's Jesus Take the Wheel. I don't know. It's not in the text. Or maybe it would be Jesus Take the Rudder. I don't know, but I can imagine that's what took place. They're very scared. Like they realize that this could be the end of our lives. This is it. We're done. And so they're seeking to save their lives. And so what they do is they gird the ship, which, how many of you have used the word gird the past week? Anybody? All right, there we go. Gird means to bind a ship together with rope or cables to enable it to survive the force of waves and tempest. So they're trying to bind the ship together, to hold it together, because essentially what's happening is the storm is trying to twist the ship and break it apart. And so they do that. Well, let's save the ship. And then they say, okay, well, we have this cargo that's weighing us down. Let's just throw that in the ocean, because that's a great idea when you're a cargo ship, to throw the cargo in the ocean. And then the next day, they end up throwing all the tackle overboard, all the stuff that's needed for sailing. They're at such a point of desperation where, like, whatever we can do to up our chances of survival, we'll do it. And then we get to verse 20. For many days, neither sun nor stars appeared, and the severe storm kept raging. Finally, all hope was fading that we would be saved. So you've got 200 and some individuals who are resigned to the fact that we're going to die. Like there's no hope. We've done everything we can. We've bound the ship together. We've thrown the cargo overboard. But for days, it has been storm. We haven't even seen the sun. It's just been storm for days. So you can imagine the mental place that these individuals are in, that just place of despair and just giving up. We're going to die. There's nothing we can do. And then Paul in verse 21, since they had been without food for a long time, which reminds me of those Snickers commercials. Have y'all seen? Where somebody is acting hangry and they eat a Snickers and they're happy again? Anyway, it reminds me of that. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul then stood up among them and said, "You men should have followed my advice not to sail from Crete and sustain this damage and loss." Can we just pause? Like, that's funny, okay? Paul's like, "Hey guys, I've been shipwrecked a few times. We probably shouldn't do this." Paul, you're an idiot. We're doing it anyway. Okay, shoot yourself. And then Paul's like, "Hey guys, you remember that talk we had a few days ago? I was right." Now, it would be interesting. You could read this, that he's being sarcastic. I don't think that's what he's doing. I think what he's actually trying to do is not be a smart aleck, but trying to encourage the individuals of his trustworthiness because of what he's going to say next. He says next, "Now I urge you to take courage, because there will be no loss of any of your lives, but only of the ship. For last night an angel of the God I belong to and serve stood by me and said, 'Don't be afraid, Paul. It's necessary for you to appear before Caesar. And indeed, God has graciously given you all those who are sailing with you.'" And so Paul says, hey guys, God's revealed to me, if we stick together, none of us are going to die. None of us are going to perish. We're going to lose the ship, yes, but we will escape with our lives. And so as the passage continues, essentially, the ship is adrift in the Adriatic Sea. And they believe, okay, we're getting close to land. And so what they do is they took soundings, which is a shipman's term for measuring the depth of the water. And the first one, it's 120. And the next one, it's 90. And I'm not a mathematician, but 90 is less than 120, right? Okay, yes, y'all are nodding. This is good. You're with me. Which means they would be getting closer to what? Land. Now, this is a good thing, yes, but it's a bad thing when you are swiftly approaching land and you have no control of said ship. That's bad. That would be like you being on the interstate going 60. You're headed towards the house, but you have no control of your car. Not exactly what you want. And so what they do is they drop 4 anchors behind them, and the goal is to just slow the ship down. Because they know that if they impact land at the speed they're going, that ship's gone. And so they drop these anchors, and then they pray. They spend time praying. In Acts 27:39, when daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but sighted a bay with a beach. And they planned to run the ship ashore if they could. So what do? Now they're anchored, and so they have to cut those anchors and sail towards land. And I can almost imagine some of them who might have been a little cynical of Paul, of, hey, Paul, you said we were going to lose the ship. We're sailing towards land and we're just fine. And I'd like to think as they said that, boom, that's when they hit the sandbar and Paul's like, I told you guys, come on, when are you going to stop second guessing me? But that's what happens. They strike a sandbar and the ship gets stuck. But the waves are still pounding the ship again and again and again, and the ship starts breaking apart. And so what they do is they say, hey, those of you who know how to swim, there's land. You better go find it. Those of you who don't know how to swim, hold on for a second because the ship's going to break apart. You just grab what piece you can and you doggy paddle, you kick whatever you can to get to shore. And so that's what happens. Those who can swim, they start swimming. Those who aren't good swimmers, they grab something buoyant and they hold on and they float to land. And so finally they all arrive at Malta and they're all there safely. God, no surprise, God keeps his word that, hey, nobody's going to perish. But they're now on this island that none of them know anything about. They've been deprived of food. They've been at sea for weeks, and they're exhausted. So what takes place? Acts 28, verse 2. The local people showed us extraordinary kindness. They lit a fire and took us all in, since it was raining and cold. So these local people that they've never met start a fire and begin taking care of them. And there's this little passage in there that I love. Like Paul is serving everybody and he says, okay, we've got a fire going. Let me gather some firewood for everybody. And so he's doing that. He's trying to serve it and be a servant leader and gather firewood. And as he does it, a snake bites him. The passage doesn't actually verbatim say it bit him, but it says a snake wrapped around him and we can assume the snake bit him. And so Paul, I love how the passage talks about it because it's so nonchalant. Like at first the locals are like, oh, well, he must be a murderer. And that's like God's judgment on him for being a murderer is that the snake bought him or the snake bit him. And Paul just sort of does one of these, like shakes the snake off in the fire and goes about his business. And the locals lose their mind. Like, oh my goodness. And what they say is, well Paul, he must be a god that he got bit by a snake and he survived and he's okay. So they go from he must be being judged by God to he's a god very quickly. It sort of reminds me of this scene. How many of you have ever seen Star Wars? If you've seen Star Wars, you'll know this scene where the Ewoks begin worshiping C-3PO as a god. If you haven't seen Star Wars, this makes no sense and makes me look like even more of a nerd than you already thought I am, and I'm okay with that. But it reminds me of that scene. We see these people, and they almost begin worshiping Paul. They think he's a god. But what does Paul do? He says, no. I am not. I'm not, but let me tell you about God. Because Paul was on Malta for about 3 months. Because remember, that's where they sort of got through the winter, was at Malta. And so Paul was there for 3 months, and as the passage goes on, we see that Paul heals people. He proclaims the gospel even after all of the hardship that he's been through. After everything that Paul's been through, you would imagine that he wants to rest, right? Like, how many of you would be tired? You're like, I'm shipwrecked for the 4th time in my life. I think I deserve a siesta, okay? Like, but no, Paul's like, hey, I want to share the gospel with these people. I want to point them towards Christ. And so that's what he does. And after 3 months, eventually, they sail on to Rome. They find a new ship. They sail to Syracuse, where they spend 3 days, Rhegium, and then sail 2 days to Puteoli, and then they hike to Rome. And they stop at Forum Appius and 3 taverns, or 2 places where they stopped, where Paul stops there to meet with other believers in the area and to encourage them and to be encouraged by them. And N.T. Wright, of this whole passage, this is what he says. He says, new creation is happening, and the powers of evil cannot stop it. Paul may arrive in Rome a more bedraggled figure than he would have liked, but the gospel which he brings is flourishing, and nobody can stop it. And that's what we see. Even in the midst of the hardships, we see the gospel flourishing. Paul being faithful to proclaim the gospel. But now that we've seen this journey, we've got to ask the question, okay, how does it apply to my life? Anybody here been shipwrecked? Okay, so I don't think the point of this passage is how to survive a shipwreck. Like, I don't think that's what the Bible is getting at. So how do we apply it to our lives? What can we learn? How do we apply it? Remember, we saw that we're to rely upon God's faithfulness in the midst of hardship. But how do we do that? The first thing I think is that we remember God's mission. Remember, we just talked about it. Even in the midst of all this hardship, even in the midst of everything going on, Paul remembers that the mission of God is to make what? To make disciples. That's what we see in Matthew 28:19. Therefore, as you go, make disciples. And so Paul, as he's going about this hardship in his life, he says, you know what? I'm not going to lose sight of the fact that the mission of God is to make disciples. So even in the midst of my difficulties, I'm going to still proclaim the gospel and seek to point people towards him. He doesn't lose sight of that. So we remember God's mission. We also remember God's promises. Because as we look at this, even at the beginning of Acts, chapter 1, verse 8, we see the Bible says, you will be my witnesses to the ends of the earth. So Paul remembers that. There's a reason he's going to Rome, to proclaim the gospel. And we see in Acts 23:11, God says to Paul, he says, have courage. For as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so it is necessary for you to testify in Rome. So Paul realizes that God has promised that he's going to get to Rome. So we remember God's mission, God's promise, but also we remember God's provision. God's provision in Acts 27, verse 23. An angel appears to Paul and says, don't be afraid, Paul. It is necessary for you to appear before Caesar, and indeed God has graciously given you all of those who are sailing with you. Who's the one protecting? It's God. And we see this throughout the entirety of the book of Acts, that time and time again, God has provided for Paul over and over and over. But also, we've got to maintain an eternal perspective. He says, Zachary, what do you mean by that? That we need to think long-term, which in our society is so hard because we live in a society that says you should nuke your Pop-Tarts for 3 seconds. And that's just wrong. And I don't understand why anyone would do that. But we live in a society that wants everything now. And so we have a hard time thinking long-term. But if we look at this between Acts 23, verse 11, where God says, hey, you're going to appear in Rome, and when Paul gets to Rome is actually 2.5 years. No, we read it and we say, oh, well, it's just the next chapter. But we don't think, no, that's 2.5 years. That God had promised something, and it was 2.5 years before Paul gets to see that fulfillment. And in our day and age, in our culture, we have such a hard time with that. Because we say, okay, God promised it, and I need it now. And sometimes, no, we need to have an eternal perspective, to think long term. But also the other thing we've got to remember, how we rely upon God's faithfulness, is that we should be encouraged by other believers. We see numerous times along this trip where Paul is with other believers encouraging them, but they also are encouraging him. And so if we really want to rely upon God's faithfulness, we need to live life with other believers who can remind us of the promises of God. And so this applies, yes, individually and personally to our lives of this is how we rely upon God's faithfulness, but I also think it applies collectively to us as a church. For us as a church, my desire as a pastor is that we would remember God's mission, that we would remember his promises, his provision, that we would have an eternal perspective, and that we would encourage one another, just like we see in this passage with Paul. Was Paul going through a difficult time? Okay, this was not a trick question. I know y'all are like, I don't know if I should answer. Is Paul going through a difficult time here? Yes, it's not easy at all. Yet who does he rely on? The Lord. Are there times personally that we go through hardships? Yeah. Are there times collectively as a church we go through difficulties? Yeah. Y'all could say that flooding, having a sanctuary get struck by lightning, catch fire, getting robbed, and plenty of other things in there, that's not necessarily the easiest of years, right? But who do we rely on in those times? Do we rely on ourselves or do we rely on God? And I want to show you a quick video of a church that was on a decline. And they really, sort of like us, we put everything on the table and said, God, where are you calling us? Their story is very different than ours. God called them to go about things in a very different way, but I want you to see this story because I think you see very clearly a church that in the middle of hardship relied upon God and his will, not on their own strength. Just like we see Paul in the midst of hardship, not relying on his own strength, but relying on the God that he serves. Check out this video.
It all comes to the point of what do you want more? I mean, do you want your preferences or do you want people to be reached in the community for Christ? That's just what it boils down to. People to be coming to Christ or to do things the way that you've always done them.
Approximately 900 Southern Baptist churches cease to exist every single year.
If we have a strong, healthy group of churches, we're going to have a strong, healthy gospel work going on in this city of 1.2 million people.
When a church dies, it really robs God of his glory. That church has sat there on that corner for decades and said, we have the answer, Jesus is the answer. And then when that church closes its doors, it tells the community, well, maybe not.
There's something special about seeing God redeem the ministry of that church so that it can flourish again. It's a testimony to the people around that church that God is still at work.
We began to look and see where would we want to go for the next 10 years. One of the things was church revitalization. And we felt that we would be in a good position to be a church that could come alongside another church that needed some help. And so ever since then, our church has just been praying, God, is there a church here in Birmingham that we could come alongside of and help to revitalize?
I've been coming to this church ever since I was born. This church had such a heart to see people accept Jesus Christ as their personal Savior. No matter where you came from, no matter what you've done, that's why it's just been a special place.
I came to McElwain because of what I saw in this church. That was a life-changing time for me. It was the warmth, the love. This is where I have my community. This is where I have my friends.
I really feel like that we wouldn't be at this place unless God opened our eyes, because you can just kind of go through the motions and not really step back and see kind of where your church is headed. Because we've just steadily been declining in number since around 1986. So the deacons and staff got together and said, hey, let's put together this vision team to figure out what our options are.
And those of us that have been here a long time had a harder time thinking about possibly turning it over to somebody else, because we love this church and we have put many, many hours into working here.
It wasn't what they expected. Usually what someone expects is you'll find the right pastor, he'll sort of flip on a switch and everybody will start coming back to church again. That's not normally what happens. Generally, Jesus wants us to lay down our priorities, lay down our agenda, be willing to sacrificially follow him and do whatever he asks us to do. And over a period of several months, that's exactly what McElwain did. They moved from really wondering what the future of their church would be to wanting to follow Jesus wherever he led them. And Jesus led them to Shades Mountain Church.
There's some unique ways that churches can handle the adoptive process. For us, we're not here to make an extension of a Shades, but we're here to help this church come to an identity of who they are in order to have the best possible witness for this community.
The top two questions that they ask is, are you going to change the name and who's going to be the pastor? Okay. And so I settled one thing. I relieved them because I said, I will not be your pastor. And they said, yay. Then the name change, we felt there needed to be a name change just for there to have that new beginning. And so Hope Community Church just resonated with us. And it felt like a great message that we could give to people.
Sometimes it means changing the name. Sometimes it means changing the design of the worship center. Those things that seem so absolutely important, you realize all that's important is that Jesus is made much of, the gospel is proclaimed, disciples are made, and the neighborhood is transformed.
I think our big word in our vision team is surrender. We had to surrender, and that's what I've been saying. I didn't want my name to change, but I surrendered, and God has made it beautiful.
It's going to look different than anything that I possibly could imagine, but that's good. That's God working. That's what God wants to do.
I mean, what kind of miracle would it be to see us do that in 20 years to another church?
Listen, when a dying church comes back to life, it's like a living sermon on that corner. The whole community sees it. Restaurants come and go, stores come and go, neighborhoods come and go. The one thing that needs to be constant in that community is the Church of Jesus Christ. We have the eternal message. And so I would encourage other churches in the region to look for churches that need help and work with your association and find how you can make a difference in that congregation and make a difference for the kingdom right here in your city and across North America and around the world.
So in the midst of hardship, both individually, personally, but also in the midst of hardship as a church collectively, who do we trust? My prayer is that we'd rely on God, just like we see Paul do. I want to close with this statement from N.T. Wright, who, about this passage, he says, "The storms do not mean that the journey is futile. They merely mean that Jesus is claiming the world as his own, and that the powers of the world will do their best to resist." You know, as we seek to honor God, we seek to follow him faithfully, there are going to be hardships. It's not because the journey's futile. It's because there is an adversary who does not want the kingdom of God to be advanced. And we shouldn't be surprised that sometimes those hardships mean that we're actually on the right track and that Satan doesn't like what God's doing. And so we shouldn't grow weary and lose heart. We should say, "Oh, Satan, bring it, because my God's bigger than you, and I'm not scared," even in the midst of hardship and difficulty. And maybe as we've dived into God's word, maybe there's something that God's laid on your heart. And maybe you'd like to chat with me or one of the other pastors. I'll be up here after the service and would love to chat with you. If you want to fill out the Connect card and drop that in the box back there, I would love to connect with you. Or if you're more tech savvy, you can text decisions to 97000. But if there's something that God's laid on your heart, you need prayer, be faithful to respond however God leads. But I would say in closing that my prayer for us as a church is that we would truly remember the faithfulness of God, that we would rely on his faithfulness as we deal with hardship. That we wouldn't try to do it on our own, but that we would rely on him just like we see Paul do. Because if I'm honest with you, I see 3, 4, 5 years down the road when we're finally gathered in there again, because we wouldn't be able to fit everybody in here. It's not because we're great, it's because the God we serve is great, and he has called us to reach the community, and that is what we will do. And now will that mean doing things a little differently than maybe we were used to? Sure. But for the sake of someone's salvation, you know what? I'm okay with being uncomfortable. Are you? I'm okay with that. Because, man, I want to get as many people to heaven as we can. That's the goal. Not that we do it, but that God does. And so we're faithful to love and serve our community well and point them towards Christ.